HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The China Lover, a novel, by Ian Buruma, read by Nigel Patterson. Part 1. 1. There was a time, hard to imagine now, when the Japanese fell in love with China. Well, not all Japanese, of course, but enough to be able to speak of a China boom. Like all such crazes in my country, the China boom was only a fleeting thing, here today and gone tomorrow, but it was spectacular while it lasted. The boom hit the country in the autumn of 1940, just as our foolish army was getting trapped in a quagmire of its own making. Nanking had fallen a few years before. Our bombers were roughing up Chongqing, but all to no purpose. Frankly, we were like a tuna fish trying to eat a whale. Back in Tokyo, the humid summer heat lingered unpleasantly. Asakusa, usually so full of life, looked exhausted, as though people no longer had the energy to enjoy themselves. Most of the action had moved west anyway, to the Ginza area, but even there a gloomy atmosphere hung heavily in the sultry air. The coffee houses were half empty. Bars had fallen on hard times. The food in the restaurants didn't taste as good as before. Joy was, in any case, if not yet strictly forbidden, officially discouraged as unpatriotic. Then came that crazy China boom, like a rainbow in a dark grey sky. Films set in China were suddenly the rage. And all the girls wanted to look like Ri Koran, the Manchurian movie star. You would see them strolling down the Ginza, their short legs like plump white daikon radishes squeezed into tight silk dresses. Cosmetics were used to make their eyes look more slanting, more exotic, more Chinese. China Nights, Ri Koran's hit song, evoking the louche glamour of nocturnal Shanghai, was played on the wireless all day long. The girls would hum its lilting tune, closing their eyes in rapture, gently swaying like tropical flowers. A coffee bar in Sukiyabashi, named China Nights, employed Ri Koran lookalikes. Not that they really looked like her. Their crooked teeth and stocky build betrayed them immediately as Japanese country girls. But there they were, wrapped in a bit of garish silk, with a flower in their hair. That was enough. The men went crazy over them. Perhaps the drabness of the home front made the Asian continent seem alluring by contrast, and it is not as if this boom was the first of its kind. As I said, we Japanese often catch collective bugs, which cause temporary fevers for this or that. You might say it's in our blood. But perhaps the real reason was more mundane. Listening to Ri Koran's song allowed people to forget, if only for a short while, about wars, economic slumps, and soldiers slogging through the mud of a blood-soaked land. Instead of being a place of 1,000 sorrows, sucking us into worse and worse horrors, China became a place of glamour, promising untold pleasures. It all seems so long ago now, as I contemplate the wreckage of our foolish dreams. China Nights is long gone, the Ginza a ruin, Japan a country of ruins. I'm a ruin. Anyway, just a year after it erupted, the China boom was all over. After Pearl Harbor, victory over the Anglo-American barbarians was all people thought about. It proved to be just another one of our dreams, a mirage in the desert toward which we, a thirsty people, crawled in the vain hope that we would quench our thirst for a little justice and respect. But before getting ahead of my story, I should like to explain my own love for China, which was not at all like that superficial China boom of 1940. To understand my feelings, I have to take you back to the 1920s, to my native village near Aomori, a small place in a narrow-minded province of a small country, whose people held the narrow views of frogs stuck in a dark well. To me, China, with its vast spaces, its teeming cities, and its 5,000 years of civilization, always represented an escape from the well. I was one little frog that got away. Where I grew up, loving China was not exactly viewed with approval. There was old Matsumoto-sensei, of course, a thin man in a faded blue kimono and tortoise-shell glasses, whose long white hair floated around his shriveled neck like a tangle of cobwebs. But the China he loved stopped somewhere in the 12th century. He lived in a world of musty Confucian classics, whose wisdom he attempted to impart to us with scant success. I can still picture him, his head almost touching the pages of the Analects, a half-smile playing on his cracked lips as he traced the Chinese characters with the long brown fingernail of his right index finger, oblivious to the sniggers of his pupils. Even now, when I hear the names of Koshi, Confucius, or Moshi, Mencius, the image of Matsumoto-sensei comes back to me, with the burnt milk smell of an old man's breath. My father, Sato Yukichi, had actually been to China as a soldier in 1895, but there was no love lost between him and the country of his former enemies. He didn't mention the Sino-Japanese War often. I even wonder whether he ever had more than the haziest idea of what it was all about. Just once in a while, when he had drunk too much sake, he would throw back his head and burst into a marching song, cupping his hand to his mouth, imitating the sound of a trumpet. He would then bore us with stories about Commander Koga rescuing the imperial flag, or some such act of derring-do. Or he went on about the weather in Manchuria, which, as he never tired of telling us, was colder even than our snow country in winter, so cold that your piss froze solid, like an icicle, from the tip of your penis to the frozen ground. Mother would always withdraw at this point and make clattering noises as she busied herself in the kitchen. One day, when I was still a boy, I discovered a lacquer box among my father's books, which contained some woodcuts of famous battle scenes set in landscapes covered in thick snow. Since the pictures had hardly ever been exposed to daylight, the colours were still as crisp and true as when they were first printed, fiery reds and yellows of gunfire, the dark blues of wintry nights. The horses, in pretty checkered padding from their necks to their ankles, were so vividly drawn that you could almost sense them shivering in the snow. I can still remember the titles: Hard Fight of Captain Asakawa, Banzai for Japan, Victory Song of Pyongyang. And the Chinese, they were depicted as cringing, yellow, rat-like creatures, with slitty eyes and pigtails, either writhing in terror or prostrated under the boots of our triumphant soldiers. The Japanese, looking splendid in their black Prussian-style uniforms, were much taller than these dead Chinese rodents. They looked almost like Europeans. This didn't strike me as particularly odd at the time, nor can I say that it filled me with pride. I couldn't help wondering why beating such pathetic enemies should be presented as something so glorious. These pictures were my first glimpse of a wider world, far away from our village near Aomori. But they were not what made me dream of leaving the old place. I think, now I look back, that such dreams were nurtured by something more artistic. I've always thought of myself as an artist at heart, a man of the theatre. This began at a very early age. Not that we had the opportunity of visiting anything so grand as a kabuki theatre. You had to go to Aomori for that. Our village was too remote even for the travelling players, offering a bawdier and much inferior form of drama. And even if they had graced us with their temporary presence, my father would never have let me go anywhere near such entertainments anyway. As the village schoolmaster, he prided himself on his respectability. Men of substance, in his view, did not go to see performing riff-raff. Entertainment, where I grew up, consisted of one man only, the estimable Mr. Yamazaki Tetsuzo, candy-man and paper theatre performer. He would arrive on festival days on his old Fuji bicycle, carrying a wooden contraption rather like a portable set of drawers that contained a box of candies, a paper screen, and a stack of pictures, which he would pass in front of the screen one by one, while mimicking the voices of characters shown in the pictures. Since our village was buried in thick snow during the winter season, Yamazaki could only reach us in spring and summer. We always knew he was coming as soon as we heard the sound of wooden clappers, which he knocked together to announce his arrival. Before the show began, he would sell candy. Those lucky enough to have money to buy it were allowed to sit right in front of the screen. I was never that fortunate. My father, though rarely expressly forbidding my attendance at the Candyman's theatre, certainly didn't approve of spending any money. Apart from anything else, he declared that such candy was unhygienic. He may have been right, but it wasn't the candy that provided the main attraction. Mr. Yamazaki wasn't much to look at. A skinny, bespectacled man with a few licks of well-greased hair swept across his shining pate. Though he told the same stories over and over, he allowed himself room for improvisation. When he spoke in the falsetto voice of a beautiful woman, you almost believed that the skinny old Candyman, as if by magic, had been transformed into a great beauty. And when the beauty turned out to be a ghost, who slunk off at the end of the story as a malevolent fox, his impersonation of the animal trickster made us break out in a cold sweat. His sound effects were as important as the lurid illustrations of brave boy heroes and demon foxes. He was especially good at such dramatic touches as rolling thunderstorms, the clip-clop of wooden sandals, and the clashing of samurai swords. But his pièce de résistance, most popular with us, his most devoted fans, who would anticipate its coming like true connoisseurs of the theatre, was the extraordinary honking fart emitted by the pompous lord in a well-worn story called Snake Princess. On and on he went, like a human trombone, for what seemed like minutes without pause, his face getting redder and redder, veins bulging on his forehead, as though he were about to explode. We were in hysterics, no matter how many times we'd seen this remarkable performance. But then, suddenly, like a pricked balloon, his face quickly regained its normal shape, and he stopped the show, even though the story was still far from reaching its conclusion. He wrapped up his pictures and folded the makeshift stage, neatly stacking it on his Fuji bike. "More, more!" we'd shout, but to no avail. We had to be patient until the next time we heard the noise of his wooden clappers announcing his arrival. I have seen many great performances since, from far more famous entertainers than this humble Candyman, but first impressions are precious as gold. Nothing would ever compare with the magic of Mr. Yamazaki's paper theatre productions. I quite lost myself in his stories, which painted a world that was so much more attractive than the dreary, everyday life of our village. Not just more attractive, but in a way more real. In the same way that one can feel resentful at having woken up from a particularly vivid dream, I hated it when Mr. Yamazaki's stories ended in mid-flow. I was hungry for the next episode, even though I already knew exactly what was in store. There was no reason for Mr. Yamazaki to pay any special attention to me, a fawning, stage-struck little boy, who never bought any candy. But after many days of following him around like a homeless puppy, offering to polish his bicycle, asking him to take me on as his apprentice, as though my father would have let me, he finally deigned to speak to me. It was a hot afternoon. He squatted down by the dusty roadside, mopping his brow with a cotton handkerchief and sipping cold barley tea from his flask. Squinting through the smoke of his cigarette, he asked me what I wanted to do when I grew up. I said I wanted to be like him, travel around and put on theatre performances. I begged him to be my teacher. He didn't laugh or mock me, but slowly shook his head and said that it was a hard life, being a performer. He did it because he had no other choice, but I looked like a clever little boy. I could do much better than him, and he had no need for an apprentice anyway. I must have shown my disappointment, for as a kind of consolation he reached into his candy bag, fished out a picture book, and handed it to me as a gift. It was a more precious gift than the candy man could possibly have imagined. I would go so far as to say that it changed my life. For this was my introduction to Suikoden, or All Men Are Brothers, my favourite book of all time, my Bible, as it were, whose stories about Chinese sword-fighters released into the world during the 14th century as demons I learned to recite word for word. I could tell you the stories of all of them, all 108 heroes. Shishin, the warrior with the 9 dragons tattooed on his back, Roshi Ensei, Sajinki Kakusei, and on and on. These immortal warriors, battling in the marshes of central China, were so far removed from the twisted yellow creatures in my father's woodblock prints that they seemed to be from a different species altogether. They were giants, not cowering dwarfs. They had style, these fighters for justice and honour, and they were free. Perhaps that was the main thing, their sense of unlimited possibility. The Suikoden heroes could only have existed in a vast place like China. Compared to them, Japanese warriors were bumpkins with small dreams, constrained by the narrow boundaries of our small island country. I read the book over and over until the cheap paper wore so thin that it began to fall apart. Alone in the yard of our house, I wielded my bamboo sword in imaginary battles against wicked rulers, striking poses I knew from the pictures, putting myself in the roles of 9-Dragon Shishin or Welcome Rain, the dusky outlaw with his phoenix eyes. We Japanese prize loyalty and honour, but we copied these virtues from the ancient Chinese. Reading All Men Are Brothers made me wonder, even as a child, about the fate of that great nation. How could it have allowed its people to fall so low? I knew better than to ask my father, who had nothing but contempt for the Chinks. So I posed the question to Mr. Yamazaki, who tilted his head and sucked in his breath. "I don't know about such difficult matters," he said, and told me to study hard, so that one day I would know the answers to all my questions. But even though he was unable to enlighten me on the sad fate of China, he did make room for me in the front row, right under the screen perched on his bicycle, in spite of the fact that I was never able to buy any candy. 2. I first saw Yamaguchi Yoshiko perform in the great city of Mukden in October 1933. Mukden, which we called Hoten, was the busiest, most cosmopolitan city in Manchuria, more modern even than Tokyo in its best days, before our capital city was turned into a smouldering ruin by the American B-29s. It was her eyes that left the deepest impression. They were unusually large for an Oriental woman. She didn't look typically Japanese, nor typically Chinese. There was something of the Silk Road in her, of the caravans and spice markets of Samarkand. No one would have guessed that she was just an ordinary Japanese girl born in Manchuria. Before we Japanese arrived, Manchuria was a wild and terrifying place, located perilously in the border areas of Russia and China, which didn't belong to anyone. Once the seat of the great Qing dynasty emperors, Manchuria fell on hard times after the emperors had moved south to Peking. Warlords did as they liked, looting this vast region of its treasures, while pitting their bandit armies against one another, causing terrible misery to the impoverished people who were unfortunate enough to get in their way. Women were taken as slaves, and men were killed or forced to join the bandits, who swept through the villages like a swarm of locusts. The poor, long-suffering people of Manchuria ate nothing but bitterness for hundreds of years. Those few brave souls who tried to resist would end up hanging upside down from the trees, their intestines spilling out like broken wires, as terrible examples to others who might have similar ideas. Order was eventually restored, however, and not a minute too soon, when the great state of Manchukuo was founded under our tutelage. Manchukuo was a truly Asian empire, ruled by the last scion of the Qing dynasty, Emperor Puyi. But it was also a cosmopolitan empire, where all races mixed and were treated equally. Each of the 5 main races, Japanese, Manchu, Chinese, Korean, and Mongolian, had its own color on the national flag, mustard yellow with stripes of red, white, black, and blue. Then there were Russians in Harbin, Dairen, and Mukden, and Jews, as well as other foreigners from all corners of the world. Arriving at the port of Dairen, at the southern tip of Manchuria, to me felt like arriving in the great wide world. Even Tokyo felt narrow and provincial in comparison. Cosmopolitanism was in the very air. Apart from coal dust and cooking oil, you could pick up the pungent mélange of pickled Korean cabbages, steaming Russian pierogis, barbecued Manchu mutton, Japanese miso soup, and fried Peking dumplings. And the women! The Mukden women were the most beautiful north of Shanghai. The Chinese girls, lithe and nimble as eels in their tight chi-pao dresses, the kimonoed Japanese beauties, perched like finely plumed birds in their rickshaws bound for the tea-houses behind the Yokohama Specie Bank, the perfumed Russian and European ladies taking tea at Smirnov's in feathered hats and furs. Verily, Mukden was a paradise for a young wolf on the loose. Since I was a fit young man, always well turned out, I had no reason to complain of a lack of female attention. Every autumn since the early 1920s, Madame Ignatieva, who had once sung Madama Butterfly in St. Petersburg for the Tsar and Tsarina, would perform in the ballroom of the Yamato Hotel, a grand but rather forbidding establishment, whose turrets and castellated walls had the air more of a fortress than a hotel. Madame Ignatieva and her husband, a white Russian nobleman, had fled from the Communists in 1917 and lived in Mukden ever since. The Count, always impeccably dressed in his old army uniform, complete with the Cross of St. George bestowed on him personally by the Tsar, ran a boarding-house near the railway station. The highlight of Madame Ignatieva's artistry was the habanera from Carmen. She also sang arias from Tosca and Madama Butterfly, but Carmen was considered by music lovers to be her finest piece. The hall was packed. The crystal chandeliers cast a sparkling light on the gilded chairs and the medals pinned to long rows of uniformed chests. Everyone of any consequence in Mukden was there, and some people had come down especially from Shinkyo, the capital city of Manchukuo. General Itagaki of the Kanto Army, our garrison force in China, sat in front, with Hashimoto Toranosuke, head Shinto priest of Manchukuo, and Captain Amakasu Masahiko, president of the Japan-Manchukuo Friendship Association. I spotted General Li, chairman of the Shenyang Bank, looking martial in his Kaiser Wilhelm moustache, and Mr. Abraham Kaufman, head of the Jewish community, sitting in the back row, trying to stay out of the way of Konstantin Radzaevsky, an ill-mannered ruffian who was always pestering us to clean out the Jews. And there, bathed in the spotlight, was the splendid figure of Madame Ignatieva herself, dressed in a long black gown, with a shawl of black lace trailing along the floor. She smiled as she strode to the centre of the stage, a red rose in her right hand, her chin held high, acknowledging the applause with curt little nods to all sides, like a haughty pigeon. Strode is actually not the right word. She undulated voluptuously, in the way large Western women do, and right behind her was her star pupil, a sweet young Japanese girl in a long-sleeved purple kimono with a pattern of white cranes. She was like a delicate flower just before its moment of bloom, radiating a childlike innocence, as well as a kind of exotic elegance not normally seen in Japanese girls. Perhaps she was a little nervous, for just as Madame Ignatieva was about to take her place at centre stage, the girl stepped on the tip of the long black shawl, stopping her teacher in her tracks. For an instant the smile vanished from Madame Ignatieva's face, but she immediately recovered and opened her throat for the habanera. The girl's dark eyes widened, as if to plead for our forgiveness, and she blushed most prettily. It was, as I said, those wide eyes that left an indelible impression on me. Though not beautiful in any conventional sense, and rather too large for her small face, almost fish-like even, they nonetheless expressed a delightful vulnerability. There was no more trace of nervousness when she launched into her first song, following the performance of Madame Ignatieva. I remember Moonlight at the Ruined Castle, a Japanese song which made us all weep, then Beethoven's Ich liebe dich, then a folk song in Chinese, then a Russian song whose title I can't remember, and finally a charming rendering of Schubert's Serenade. It was quite clear, even at her tender age, that Yoshiko was not like the provincial warblers who can make concerts in Japan such a torment. Her command of languages and grasp of different national styles was extraordinary. Only the cosmopolitan soil of Manchukuo could have yielded such a treasure. I know it is easy to say in hindsight, but I knew then that Yoshiko, at the tender age of 13, was something very special indeed. Yoshiko was born in 1920. Her father was the kind of adventurer we called Tairiko Ronin, or continental drifter, a Sinophile who roamed across the Manchurian plains in search of fortune. This, alas, remained elusive. For the most part, he made a precarious living teaching the Chinese language to Japanese employees of the South Manchurian Railway Company. Precarious, that is, not because he was especially poorly paid, but because he had a weakness for gambling. One of his pupils at one point was me. Before she was adopted by a Chinese general, Yoshiko lived the typical life of a Japanese child on the continent, mixing freely with children of other races, even as she received the strict education of a proper young Japanese. The year of Yoshiko's birth was just a decade before the birth of Manchukuo, or perhaps one should say just 11 years before the conception of Manchukuo, for this happened with a big bang on September the 13th, 1931, when a bomb exploded on the railway tracks just outside Mukden. Quite who the culprits were was not made clear at the time. Let us assume it was from a Sino-Japanese one-night stand that Manchukuo was eventually born. Our Kanto army quickly secured all the towns along the South Manchurian Railway, and the territory was effectively ours, except at night, when local bandits still made a safe passage along the railroad impossible. Less than a year later, the former Manchu kingdom, which had gone rotten like an abandoned old mansion and become a refuge for the worst ruffians in China, became a modern state. But I'm a romantic, so I prefer an alternative date for the birth of Manchukuo. On the dawn of March the 1st, 1934, Puyi, the last scion of the Manchu dynasty, dressed in the yellow silk robes of his imperial ancestors, prayed to the sun in the garden behind his palace in Xingqiu, and was officially reborn as the Emperor of Manchukuo. The moment he emerged from his audience with the sun, the new state had become an empire. I was obviously not allowed to attend this ceremony, which had to be carried out by him alone. But I shall never forget the sight of Emperor Puyi later that day, in his magnificent double-breasted uniform, with gold epaulettes streaming down his narrow but hallowed shoulders, and a gold helmet sprouting red-tinted ostrich feathers. The band played the Manchukuo anthem as the emperor goose-stepped along a red carpet to his throne, escorted by Prince Chichibu, 3 officers of the Kanto army, and 10 Manchurian page boys from a local orphanage. His trousers were too long, his bespectacled head almost disappeared into his feathered helmet, and his goose steps made him look a bit like a puppet on strings. Frankly, the ceremony was not entirely devoid of comedy, and yet there was an unmistakable sense of grandeur.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?